fascinating subjects or objects that you can spend observing is the night sky. It's filled with thousands upon thousands of stars and planets, and of course there's the moon. And as part of our adventure photography series, we're going to spend some time actually photographing the night sky. It's actually quite easier to do than what you might realize. In our first attempt, we're going to show you how to create a time-lapse event where you take a series of photographs over a specified amount of time and you blend them all together into a single video where you can actually see the stars moving across the sky. It's going to be a lot of fun, so come and join me once again beyond the campfire as we explore the magnificent stars of the night sky. Now, when you're shooting a time-lapse event, you're going to want to use a device called an intervalometer. An intervalometer is simply a device that plugs into your camera, and it allows you to take a series of photographs over a specified amount of time. They're really quite simple to set up. It's just a matter of selecting how long an interval you want to use and then how many photographs that you want it to take. The one I have here is one that I purchased from Amazon a few years ago. It cost about $25 or so. It works quite well. You can get them for all makes and manner and types of cameras that you have out there. Now, to set up your exposure, what I normally do is that I set the camera up to actually create the exposure. All I'm using the device for is to actually trigger it. And for a simple time lapse like we're going to do tonight, I'm going to use a 15-second exposure at f2.8 with 18mm lens with an ISO of 800. And that will give me a pretty solid or very nice exposure without actually blowing the sky out and you know, not worrying too much about any kind of streaks or anything like that in the photographs. So it's a matter then of just plugging it in, getting your composure or your exposure set right, getting your composition set, turning it on and letting it run. Once you get it programmed, it's as simple as that. So we're going to do some of that here after a while when it gets dark, and then we're going to show you the results. So let's go. All right, one thing to keep in mind when you're setting up your exposure or setting up your composition for your time lapse is that composition actually is just as important in the night sky photography as it is in any other kind of photography. Same principles apply. Light and composition are the main ingredients there. And so what I like to do is that I like to include something in the foreground, something like a line of trees, a single tree, sometimes it's really strong, a barn, some type of building or whatever it may. It could be, you know, it depends on where your location is and you know what you're really trying to accomplish. But you do want to have something in your foreground to kind of add an element of interest. Also to keep in mind is that you need to be away from the city. The city lights create a lot of ambient light that gets reflected off of the atmosphere, and it's very difficult to photograph the night sky when it's like that. So you need to drive away from the city and find an area that's relatively dark. And you know, it just kind of depends on where you live and what, you know, if you live in a big, large metropolitan area, you may have to go quite a little ways to get away from that. If you live in a smaller community, you know, just a few miles may be all you need to find a nice dark area to do that. So keep those things in mind as you're setting up your exposure and setting up your composition to photograph the night sky. All right, we're going to take a few seconds here, or a few minutes, and just talk about how we set up the intervalometer. As you can see, it has a short cable on here. It's about 3 feet long, and it connects into the side of the camera right over here. The camera will be set up for its exposure later on, but it will be set at f2.8, 15 seconds for the shutter, ISO at 800, and the focal length will be 18 millimeters, and it'll be set on manual focus, and it'll be focused all the way out to infinity. And to actually make this work, if you notice up here at the top, you see delay, you see long, you see interval, and then you see the number or the letter N. The delay is a way that allows you to give a time delay before the actual sequencing starts. So you can set it for hours, minutes, or seconds. In this particular case, I'm only going to set it for a few seconds because that's all I'm really going to need. So I'll have the cursor under the delay, hit that, and the hour section starts blinking. I flip it over to minutes, and I flip it over to seconds, and then I just run it up to 2 or 3 seconds, or 4 or 5, whatever you want to run it up to. And then you hit set. So I've got it set at 5 seconds right now, and so when I start the thing, there'll be a 5-second delay before the first photograph starts. And then you can flip the little button over here, and it takes you over to underneath the long category. Now what that allows you to do is to let the intervalometer set your exposure length. In this case, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let the camera do all of that. Anything under 30 seconds, you can just let your camera do. If you need to run something, say, for 45 seconds or a minute or something like that, then you'd want to use this, because most cameras won't shoot beyond 30 seconds. But in this case, I'm just going to leave it to 0 because I don't need it to do that. And then I'm going to flip it over to interval. The interval then is the length of time between each exposure. Now with the camera making a 15-second exposure, I have to set that interval setting to something more than that. In this case, I'm going to set it to 20 seconds. So I'm going to flip that, and the second part starts, and then I just go up. Again, you just count it up to however far you want to go. There's 20 seconds right there. I don't know if you can see that. Sometimes the numbers don't show up very well. And then you hit set. So what will happen is when this thing fires off, the camera will make a 15-second exposure, and then the shutter will close. There'll be a 5-second delay, and then the next exposure counts that 5-second delay. Plus 15 is 20 seconds. So that's kind of where we come up with that. And then we're going to flip it over here to where it says N. The N is the number of exposures that you actually want it to make, and it starts with 1. And again, you hit the set button, and you just kind of count it up to however many you want to go. I'm just going to go up to 5, but tonight I'll be setting it up to something like 150 to 200. 150 will give you about 4 or 5 seconds of time lapse length. It's just kind of the way it is. I'm not going to go into details as to why that is, but then I'm going to hit that, hit the set button, and I'm going to take 5 pictures. I'm just going to flip it back 1 step to the interval, and you say I've got a 20-second delay, or I got 20-second interval. I'm going to shoot 5, so camera's already turned on. So I'm just going to hit stop or start. It's going to count down from 5 from the delay. Then the first picture gets made, and then it goes. If I had this thing set on a 15-second exposure, then it would run through its sequence. And this is going to count down to 20, or count down from 20. 3, 2, 1. Takes the next picture. You can kind of hear it click in there. And we're not going to run through all of them. And as you can see, the number changes each time down here. So we're just going to stop it at this point. So that's very briefly how these things are set up. It's very simple to do. Different makes and brands probably operate a little differently, but they're all fundamentally the same. I've had a lot of friends of mine, or a number of friends of mine, who are really excellent photographers, who really never attempt to do things like photographing the night sky. And you know, their reasonings I have to respect. They say, well, it's just not something I'm interested in. And that's all fine and good. You know, we all have our own interests, our own strengths, and things that we need to improve on, things that we like to do and don't like to do. You know, so I'm not being critical of them. But the one thing that I do want to point out is that as a photographer, the more different kinds of photography that you can get involved in, over a period of time, you will become a much stronger, much more well-rounded photographer. It's kind of like cross-training that athletes use. They don't always just train the same old way, the same old every single time. If they do that, they tend to get stale. Their body tends to not respond as well, and so their overall fitness level actually kind of stagnates. But by cross-training, they become much stronger. They challenge and stress their bodies in different ways, and that causes their body to have to continue to adapt. And so they keep improving. And the same thing applies to photography. And that's one reason why I advocate things like shooting the night sky, because it is a different type of photography. You have to think about the exposure equation in a different way. You know, instead of a lot of light with some darks and midtones that kind of break the scene up, to where you have nothing but dark with a little bit of light. And so it's a whole different kind of thought process and equation as far as the photography goes. It challenges you in different ways. So don't be afraid. The whole point of this is to not be afraid to try something new. Shooting the night sky is a fascinating form of photography, and it's actually quite easy to do. It's not anywhere near as difficult as you might think it is. So keep that in mind as you're out there trying to create a time lapse.